Question 1. The analysis reveals that a financial services firm, operating under stringent regulatory oversight, is experiencing significant delays in its disaster recovery plan implementation due to conflicting priorities between IT infrastructure restoration and the immediate resumption of customer-facing trading platforms. The IT department advocates for a comprehensive infrastructure rebuild before activating any trading functions, citing data integrity concerns, while the business unit insists on prioritizing the trading platforms to minimize financial losses from market inactivity. Which of the following approaches best addresses this implementation challenge while adhering to professional disaster recovery, best practices, and regulatory expectations for financial institutions? Option A. Focus solely on restoring the core IT infrastructure components, deferring the activation of customer-facing trading platforms until all infrastructure elements are confirmed to be operational and secure. Option B. Halt all recovery efforts until the IT department can fully rebuild and test the entire IT infrastructure, ensuring absolute data integrity across all systems before any business operations are resumed. Option C. Delegate the decision-making authority for recovery prioritization to the IT department, trusting their technical expertise to determine the most efficient order for system restoration. Option D. Implement a phased recovery strategy that prioritizes the restoration of critical trading platform functionalities and associated data, followed by the broader IT infrastructure rebuild, ensuring continuous communication and validation with business stakeholders throughout the process. Correct answer is D. Implement a phased recovery strategy that prioritizes the restoration of critical trading platform functionalities and associated data, followed by the broader IT infrastructure rebuild, ensuring continuous communication and validation with business stakeholders throughout the process. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common implementation challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for rapid recovery with the practical constraints of resource availability and cost-effectiveness, particularly when dealing with critical business functions. The professional challenge lies in making informed decisions that align with regulatory requirements and business objectives without compromising the integrity of the recovery process. Careful judgment is required to assess the true criticality of systems and data, the feasibility of different recovery strategies, and the potential impact of disruptions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased recovery strategy based on a thorough business impact analysis, BIA, and risk assessment. This aligns with regulatory expectations for demonstrating due diligence in disaster recovery planning, ensuring that the most critical functions are restored first, thereby minimizing financial and operational losses. This systematic approach, often mandated by frameworks like those guiding the 312-76 exam, ensures that recovery efforts are targeted, efficient, and demonstrably effective in meeting business continuity objectives. It also allows for a more manageable and less resource-intensive recovery process. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on restoring all systems simultaneously, regardless of criticality, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach ignores the fundamental principles of disaster recovery and business continuity, potentially leading to wasted resources, prolonged downtime for essential services, and a failure to meet regulatory obligations for timely recovery of critical functions. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of risk management and prioritization, which are core tenets of professional disaster recovery practice. Another incorrect approach that relies on an untested or outdated recovery plan is also professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct regular testing and validation is a direct contravention of best practices and often implied regulatory requirements for ensuring the efficacy of DR plans. It creates a false sense of security and significantly increases the likelihood of failure during an actual disaster, leading to severe business disruption and potential legal repercussions. Finally, an approach that delegates DR planning and implementation entirely to IT staff without adequate business unit involvement is a critical oversight. This siloed approach fails to capture the nuanced business requirements and priorities essential for an effective BIA and recovery strategy. It can lead to recovery plans that do not adequately address business needs, resulting in a failure to meet operational objectives and potentially violating regulatory mandates, that require a holistic approach to business resilience. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive BIA to identify critical business functions and their recovery time objectives (RTO) and recovery point objectives (RPO). This is followed by a thorough risk assessment to understand potential threats and vulnerabilities. Based on these analyses, recovery strategies are developed, documented, and regularly tested. Communication and collaboration with all relevant stakeholders, including business units and senior management, are paramount throughout the process. Adherence to established industry standards and regulatory guidelines provides a robust foundation for effective disaster recovery planning and implementation. Question 2. Quality control measures reveal that the organization's disaster recovery plan has not been formally reviewed or updated in over 3 years, despite significant changes in the IT infrastructure and business processes. The current plan's documentation is also inconsistent, with some sections referencing outdated technologies and procedures. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and compliant course of action? Option A. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review and update of the disaster recovery plan, involving all relevant stakeholders, and establish a formal schedule for future reviews and documentation updates to ensure ongoing compliance and effectiveness. Option B. Focus solely on updating the technical recovery procedures within the plan, assuming that business process changes will be addressed organically during a disaster event. Option C. Conduct a superficial review of the existing plan, making minor edits to reflect the most obvious recent changes, and defer a full update until the next scheduled audit cycle. Option D. Archive the current plan and begin the process of developing an entirely new disaster recovery plan from scratch, without referencing the existing documentation. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review and update of the disaster recovery plan, involving all relevant stakeholders, and establish a formal schedule for future reviews and documentation updates to ensure ongoing compliance and effectiveness. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust, compliant documentation with the practical realities of ongoing business operations and evolving threats. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the disaster recovery plan not only meets the explicit requirements of the relevant regulatory framework, but also remains a living document, adaptable to changes in the business environment and the threat landscape. A failure to adequately document and regularly review the plan can lead to noncompliance, operational inefficiencies during a disaster, and ultimately, reputational damage and financial loss. The correct approach emphasizes a proactive and systematic method for maintaining the integrity and effectiveness of the disaster recovery plan. This involves establishing clear responsibilities for plan maintenance, defining a schedule for regular reviews and updates, and ensuring that all changes are documented and communicated. This aligns with the principles of good governance and risk management, which are often implicitly or explicitly mandated by regulatory bodies. By embedding these practices into the organizational culture, the company demonstrates a commitment to resilience and compliance, ensuring that the plan remains relevant and actionable. An incorrect approach that relies solely on ad hoc updates or assumes the initial plan is sufficient ignores the dynamic nature of business and technology. This can lead to a plan that is outdated, contains inaccuracies, and fails to address current risks. Such an approach would likely violate regulatory requirements for maintaining up-to-date business continuity and disaster recovery documentation, potentially resulting in penalties. Another incorrect approach, focusing only on technical recovery without considering the broader business impact and communication strategies, creates a plan that is incomplete and may not adequately support the organization's overall recovery objectives. This also represents a failure to meet comprehensive regulatory expectations for disaster preparedness. A third incorrect approach, neglecting to involve key stakeholders in the review process, can result in a plan that is not understood or supported by those who will be responsible for its execution, undermining its effectiveness and potentially leading to noncompliance due to a lack of practical implementation. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework. This involves identifying specific requirements related to disaster recovery plan documentation, review cycles, and stakeholder involvement. Next, assess the current state of the disaster recovery plan against these requirements and the organization's operational realities. Develop a strategy that prioritizes actions to address any gaps, focusing on establishing clear ownership, implementing a regular review and update schedule, and ensuring comprehensive stakeholder engagement. Finally, continuously monitor the effectiveness of the disaster recovery program and adapt it as necessary to maintain compliance and resilience. Question 3. System analysis indicates that during a recent disaster recovery preparedness assessment, a critical vulnerability was discovered in the primary data backup system. This vulnerability, if exploited during a disaster event, could lead to the corruption or complete loss of critical business data, severely impacting the organization's ability to recover operations. The assessment report is due to senior management and the regulatory compliance officer within 48 hours. The IT director has expressed concern that reporting this vulnerability at this stage might cause significant delays in the upcoming operational readiness review and could reflect poorly on the IT department's performance. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Downplay the severity of the vulnerability in the report, describing it as a minor issue that is unlikely to affect recovery operations significantly and suggest a low-priority fix. Option B. Omit the mention of the critical vulnerability from the report to avoid causing alarm and potential delays in the operational readiness review, assuming it can be addressed after the review is complete. Option C. Inform the IT team about the vulnerability and instruct them to work on a fix discreetly, without including it in the formal report to senior management or the compliance officer at this time. Option D. Fully document the vulnerability and its potential impact in the disaster recovery assessment report, clearly outlining the risks to business continuity and recommending immediate remediation steps, while also informing the regulatory compliance officer of the potential compliance implications. The correct answer is D. Fully document the vulnerability and its potential impact in the disaster recovery assessment report, clearly outlining the risks to business continuity and recommending immediate remediation steps, while also informing the regulatory compliance officer of the potential compliance implications. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma in disaster recovery planning, specifically concerning the disclosure of critical vulnerabilities. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for business continuity and operational resilience against the professional and regulatory obligations to maintain data integrity and security. The pressure to downplay or omit critical findings to avoid immediate disruption or perceived blame can be significant, making objective and ethical decision-making paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves transparently and accurately reporting the identified vulnerability to the appropriate stakeholders, including senior management and the relevant regulatory bodies if mandated by law or policy. This aligns with professional ethical codes that prioritize honesty, integrity, and the duty to protect the organization and its stakeholders from foreseeable harm. In the context of disaster recovery, failing to disclose a critical vulnerability that could lead to data loss or system compromise during a disaster event is a direct contravention of the principle of ensuring robust and reliable recovery capabilities. Regulatory frameworks often mandate disclosure of significant risks that could impact business operations or data security. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to omit the vulnerability from the report to avoid immediate disruption or negative repercussions. This is a failure of professional integrity and a violation of the duty to provide accurate information. It creates a hidden risk that could have catastrophic consequences during a disaster, leading to significant financial, reputational, and legal damage. Ethically, it constitutes a misrepresentation of the system's readiness. Another incorrect approach is to downplay the severity of the vulnerability, describing it as a minor issue with little impact. This is a form of deception and a breach of professional responsibility. It misleads decision makers and prevents them from allocating necessary resources to address the problem effectively. This can also lead to regulatory noncompliance if the severity is such that it triggers reporting requirements. A third incorrect approach is to report the vulnerability only to the immediate IT team, without escalating it to senior management or relevant compliance officers. While internal awareness is important, the responsibility for strategic decision-making regarding risk mitigation and resource allocation rests with senior leadership. Failing to escalate a critical vulnerability prevents the organization from making informed decisions about its disaster recovery posture and potentially violates reporting obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in disaster recovery must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves a commitment to truthfulness, accuracy, and transparency. When faced with a critical finding, the process should include 1. Thoroughly documenting the vulnerability and its potential impact. 2. Assessing the severity and likelihood of occurrence, particularly in the context of disaster scenarios. 3. Identifying relevant regulatory and contractual obligations for disclosure. 4. Communicating the findings clearly and concisely to all necessary stakeholders, including senior management and compliance departments. 5. Recommending appropriate mitigation strategies and their associated costs and benefits. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, ethical, and aligned with the organization's overall risk management strategy and legal obligations. Question 4. During the evaluation of a disaster recovery plan's effectiveness, a disaster recovery professional discovers that the most realistic and comprehensive testing scenario requires the use of actual, albeit anonymized, client financial data. The professional is aware that even anonymized data, if improperly handled, could still pose privacy risks and potentially violate contractual obligations with clients regarding data handling. The professional must decide how to proceed with the testing. Option A. Use the actual, non-anonymized client financial data for the test, assuming that the controlled environment of the testing facility will prevent any actual breach and that the benefits of a highly realistic test outweigh the minimal perceived risk. Option B. Inform management that the testing cannot proceed as planned due to the inherent risks associated with using any form of client data, and recommend postponing the testing until a less sensitive, hypothetical data set can be developed, even if it reduces the realism of the test. Option C. Proceed with the testing using the anonymized client financial data, but also share the anonymized data with a wider group of internal stakeholders to gather broader feedback on the disaster recovery process, without specific data handling protocols for this wider group. Option D. Proceed with the testing using the anonymized client financial data, ensuring that all access to the data during the test is strictly logged and limited to essential personnel, and that the data is securely destroyed immediately after the test. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the testing using the anonymized client financial data, ensuring that all access to the data during the test is strictly logged and limited to essential personnel, and that the data is securely destroyed immediately after the test. Explanation. This scenario presents an ethical dilemma common in disaster recovery planning, specifically concerning the disclosure of sensitive information. The challenge lies in balancing the organization's need for robust testing with the ethical obligation to protect client data and maintain trust. A professional in this role must navigate the potential for reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny if sensitive information is mishandled, even in a simulated environment. The correct approach prioritizes data security and client confidentiality, aligning with fundamental ethical principles and likely regulatory requirements for data protection. By anonymizing or masking sensitive data, the professional upholds their duty to protect client information, preventing any potential breach or misuse. This proactive measure demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and risk mitigation, which is paramount in disaster recovery and business continuity. An incorrect approach that involves using actual client data, even with consent for testing purposes, carries significant ethical and regulatory risks. This could violate data privacy regulations, breach client agreements, and erode trust. The failure here is in not adequately safeguarding sensitive information, even within a controlled test. Another incorrect approach, which involves delaying the testing due to data sensitivity without proposing alternative solutions, is also problematic. While caution is warranted, an outright delay without a plan to address the data issue hinders the organization's ability to validate its disaster recovery capabilities, potentially leaving it vulnerable. This demonstrates a lack of proactive problem solving and a failure to meet the professional obligation to ensure preparedness. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core ethical and regulatory obligations. They should then explore all available technical and procedural solutions to mitigate risks while still achieving the objective. This involves open communication with stakeholders, seeking expert advice if necessary, and documenting all decisions and justifications. A structured decision-making process would involve 1. Identifying the ethical and regulatory constraints. 2. Assessing the risks associated with each potential action. 3. Evaluating the feasibility and effectiveness of proposed solutions. And 4. Selecting the option that best upholds ethical standards and regulatory compliance while achieving the desired outcome. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that a key vendor providing critical disaster recovery services has offered the lead consultant a significant personal gift, a high-value item, as a token of appreciation for the consultant's excellent work on the current project. The consultant has not yet completed the final recommendations. Option A. Accept the gift and disclose it to the client, but proceed with the recommendations without further comment, assuming the client will understand. Option B. Accept the gift and subtly adjust the final recommendations to ensure the vendor's services are highlighted favorably, thereby solidifying the positive relationship. Option C. Accept the gift, assuming it will not influence the final recommendations, and proceed with completing the study. Option D. Politely decline the gift, explaining that professional ethics prohibit accepting such personal gratuities from vendors during an active engagement, and continue with the study's recommendations objectively. The correct answer is D. Politely decline the gift, explaining that professional ethics prohibit accepting such personal gratuities from vendors during an active engagement, and continue with the study's recommendations objectively. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma where a professional's duty to their client conflicts with a potential personal gain or a desire to maintain a positive relationship with a vendor. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict while upholding professional integrity and adhering to regulatory requirements. The professional must balance the need for objective assessment with the pressures that might arise from the vendor's offer. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes client interests and professional integrity above all else. Accepting the vendor's offer, even if seemingly minor, creates a perceived or actual conflict of interest. This compromises the objectivity of the efficiency study and could lead to biased recommendations. Best professional practice, as guided by ethical codes and potentially by regulations concerning vendor relationships and conflicts of interest, depending on the specific jurisdiction's framework for disaster recovery professionals, dictates that such offers should be politely declined or, at a minimum, disclosed to the client for their informed consent. The professional's primary obligation is to provide an unbiased assessment that serves the client's best interests, ensuring the integrity of the disaster recovery plan. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the offer without disclosure. This is a direct violation of ethical principles regarding conflicts of interest and transparency. It undermines client trust and can lead to recommendations that are not in the client's best interest, potentially jeopardizing the effectiveness of their disaster recovery capabilities. This could also contravene specific clauses in professional codes of conduct or client service agreements that mandate disclosure of any potential conflicts. Another incorrect approach is to accept the offer and then attempt to subtly influence the recommendations to favor the vendor. This is a more egregious ethical breach, bordering on professional misconduct. It involves active deception and prioritizes personal gain or vendor preference over client welfare. Such actions would likely violate multiple ethical standards and could have severe professional and legal repercussions, including disciplinary action and loss of professional standing. A third incorrect approach is to accept the offer but rationalize that it will not influence the recommendations. While the professional may genuinely believe this, the appearance of impropriety is sufficient to create a conflict of interest. Professional ethics often focus on both the reality and the perception of conflicts. Failing to disclose or decline the offer, even with good intentions, erodes trust and can lead to scrutiny of the study's findings. Professional reasoning. Professionals in disaster recovery must adopt a decision-making framework that consistently places client interests and ethical conduct at the forefront. This involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest early. 2. Understanding the relevant ethical codes and regulatory requirements governing their profession and client engagements. 3. Prioritizing transparency and disclosure with the client. 4. Exercising independent judgment, free from undue influence. 5. Documenting all decisions and communications related to potential conflicts. When faced with a situation like this, the professional should immediately assess the potential for bias and err on the side of caution by declining the offer or seeking explicit client consent after full disclosure. Question 6. Quality control measures reveal a critical, previously undocumented vulnerability in the primary disaster recovery site's data replication mechanism, discovered just days before a scheduled major client audit. Senior management, concerned about the audit's outcome and potential client withdrawal, strongly urges the disaster recovery professional to manage the situation by downplaying the severity of the vulnerability in the audit report and delaying any remediation until after the audit concludes. What is the most ethically and professionally sound course of action for the disaster recovery professional? Option A. Resign from the position immediately, citing ethical concerns, without formally reporting the discovered vulnerability. Option B. Transparently report the vulnerability and its potential impact to the audit committee and relevant management, proposing an immediate remediation plan while also outlining contingency measures to mitigate risk during the audit period. Option C. Agree to management's request to downplay the vulnerability in the audit report to ensure a successful audit outcome, with a promise to address it post-audit. Option D. Attempt to implement a quick fix for the vulnerability without informing management or the audit committee, hoping to resolve it before the audit begins. The correct answer is B. Transparently report the vulnerability and its potential impact to the audit committee and relevant management, proposing an immediate remediation plan while also outlining contingency measures to mitigate risk during the audit period. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents an ethical dilemma where a disaster recovery professional is pressured to downplay a critical vulnerability discovered during a routine audit. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate business need to avoid disruption and potential reputational damage with the professional obligation to ensure the integrity and security of the disaster recovery plan. The pressure from senior management to overlook the issue, despite its potential impact on business continuity, creates a conflict of interest and tests the professional's commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves transparently reporting the discovered vulnerability to the appropriate stakeholders, including management and the relevant oversight bodies, as per the organization's incident response and reporting protocols. This aligns with the principles of professional integrity and accountability, mandated by disaster recovery best practices and likely regulatory frameworks that emphasize proactive risk management and timely disclosure of significant threats. By documenting the issue and proposing remediation steps, the professional upholds their duty to protect the organization's resilience and comply with any applicable data protection or business continuity regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves agreeing to conceal the vulnerability to avoid immediate disruption. This is a direct violation of professional ethics and potentially regulatory requirements that mandate accurate reporting of risks. It prioritizes short-term expediency over long-term security and resilience, creating a significant liability for the organization. Such an action could lead to severe consequences if the vulnerability is exploited, including financial penalties, legal action, and irreparable damage to the organization's reputation. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to fix the vulnerability without proper documentation or reporting. While seemingly proactive, this bypasses established governance and control processes. It prevents proper risk assessment, impact analysis, and the necessary approvals for changes to a critical system like a disaster recovery plan. This can lead to unintended consequences, further destabilize the system, and obscure accountability, all of which are contrary to sound disaster recovery management principles and regulatory expectations for change control. A third incorrect approach is to resign without reporting the issue. While this avoids direct complicity, it fails to fulfill the professional responsibility to safeguard the organization. The professional has a duty to report significant risks, and simply leaving without ensuring the issue is addressed leaves the organization vulnerable and potentially in violation of its own internal policies and external regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in disaster recovery must adhere to a strict code of ethics that prioritizes honesty, integrity, and the protection of the organization's assets and continuity. When faced with pressure to compromise these principles, a structured decision-making process is crucial. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical conflict and potential regulatory breaches. 2. Consulting relevant organizational policies, professional codes of conduct, and applicable regulations. 3. Documenting all findings and communications meticulously. 4. escalating the issue through appropriate channels, seeking guidance from legal counsel or ethics committees if necessary. 5. Prioritizing the long-term security and resilience of the organization over short-term pressures. Question 7. Regulatory review indicates that a disaster recovery professional, during a routine assessment of critical infrastructure, discovers a significant, previously undocumented vulnerability in a core system that, if exploited, could lead to a prolonged service outage and potential data compromise. The professional's immediate supervisor, concerned about the impact on upcoming client audits and potential stock price fluctuations, suggests downplaying the severity of the finding and delaying formal reporting until after the audit period has passed. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action for the disaster recovery professional? Option A. Agree with the supervisor to temporarily omit the vulnerability from the report, focusing on other aspects of the disaster recovery plan until after the client audits are completed. Option B. Immediately document the vulnerability and escalate it through the established incident response and risk management channels, advocating for prompt remediation, regardless of the audit schedule. Option C. Inform the supervisor that the vulnerability will be addressed, but proceed to disclose it externally to relevant regulatory bodies and industry watchdogs to ensure immediate awareness. Option D. Attempt to fix the vulnerability discreetly without informing management or the IT security team, to avoid causing alarm or disrupting ongoing processes. The correct answer is B. Immediately document the vulnerability and escalate it through the established incident response and risk management channels, advocating for prompt remediation, regardless of the audit schedule. Explanation. This scenario presents an ethical dilemma common in disaster recovery planning, specifically concerning the disclosure of vulnerabilities. The professional is tasked with balancing the organization's immediate operational needs with its long-term security and compliance obligations. The challenge lies in the potential for reputational damage and financial loss if a critical vulnerability is disclosed prematurely, versus the regulatory and ethical imperative to address and report such issues promptly. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests while upholding professional standards. The correct approach prioritizes transparency and proactive risk management, aligning with the principles of responsible professional conduct and regulatory compliance. By immediately escalating the discovered vulnerability to the appropriate internal stakeholders and initiating a remediation plan, the professional demonstrates adherence to best practices in disaster recovery and information security. This proactive stance ensures that potential impacts are mitigated before they can be exploited, safeguarding the organization and its stakeholders. It also aligns with the spirit of regulations that mandate timely identification and mitigation of risks that could lead to service disruption or data breaches. An incorrect approach that involves delaying disclosure or attempting to conceal the vulnerability represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Such actions could lead to severe consequences, including regulatory penalties, legal liabilities, and a breach of trust with clients and partners. Concealing a known vulnerability violates the professional's duty of care and integrity. Another incorrect approach, such as disclosing the vulnerability externally without proper authorization or a defined communication plan, could also be detrimental, potentially creating panic or providing a roadmap for malicious actors before the organization can implement defenses. This bypasses established incident response protocols and could be seen as unprofessional and reckless. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with such dilemmas. This involves 1. Identifying the core ethical and regulatory obligations. 2. Assessing the potential impact of the vulnerability on the organization and its stakeholders. 3. Consulting relevant internal policies and procedures, as well as applicable regulations. 4. Escalating the issue through appropriate channels to relevant decision makers. 5. Collaborating with stakeholders to develop and implement a remediation strategy. 6. Documenting all actions and decisions. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-reasoned, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 8. The performance metrics show that the primary data center has experienced a catastrophic failure, and the secondary site is now active. However, the disaster recovery team is encountering unexpected technical issues at the secondary site that are delaying the restoration of critical customer-facing applications beyond the agreed-upon recovery time objective, RTO. The pressure to restore services immediately is immense, and a senior executive is pushing for a quick fix that involves bypassing some of the standard post-failover validation and documentation procedures to get the applications back online faster. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action for the disaster recovery professional? Option A. Implement the quick fix, but ensure all deviations and the rationale for them are immediately communicated to relevant stakeholders and senior management for approval, while also planning to complete full validation and documentation as soon as operational stability is achieved. Option B. Proceed with the quick fix to restore services immediately, documenting the deviations from the standard procedures afterward to minimize business disruption. Option C. Delegate the decision-making authority for the quick fix to a junior team member to avoid personal accountability for any potential compliance issues. Option D. Halt all recovery efforts until the standard validation and documentation procedures can be fully completed, even if it means significantly exceeding the RTO and further impacting customers. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the quick fix to restore services immediately, documenting the deviations from the standard procedures afterward to minimize business disruption. Explanation: this scenario presents an ethical dilemma common in disaster recovery planning, specifically concerning the balance between immediate recovery needs and long-term compliance. The challenge lies in the pressure to restore services quickly, potentially at the expense of thorough documentation and adherence to established protocols, which could have significant regulatory and audit implications. The correct approach prioritizes a structured, documented recovery process, even under duress. This aligns with the principles of good governance and regulatory compliance, ensuring that all actions taken during a disaster are auditable and defensible. By adhering to the documented plan and ensuring proper sign-offs, the DR professional upholds their ethical duty to the organization and its stakeholders, minimizing future risks associated with noncompliance. This approach demonstrates integrity and a commitment to robust disaster recovery practices, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks governing data protection and business continuity. An incorrect approach that bypasses documentation or approval processes, while seemingly expediting recovery, creates significant ethical and regulatory risks. It undermines the integrity of the disaster recovery plan and the audit trail. This could lead to violations of data privacy regulations, financial reporting standards, or industry-specific compliance mandates. Such actions can result in severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of trust. Another incorrect approach that involves making unilateral decisions without consulting relevant stakeholders or seeking necessary approvals, even if well-intentioned, can lead to misaligned priorities, resource mismanagement, and ultimately, a less effective recovery. It fails to leverage collective expertise and can create accountability issues. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a decision-making framework that includes 1. Immediate assessment of the situation and critical needs. 2. Adherence to the established disaster recovery plan as the primary guide. 3. Clear communication with stakeholders regarding any necessary deviations or challenges. 4. Rigorous documentation of all actions taken, especially those deviating from the plan. And 5. Seeking appropriate approvals for significant decisions or deviations. This structured approach ensures that recovery efforts are both effective and compliant. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that the current disaster recovery failover process for critical financial transaction systems is experiencing significant delays, exceeding the defined RTO by an average of 30 minutes. This inefficiency is impacting business operations and potentially customer trust. What is the most effective and professionally responsible approach to address this issue? Option A. Immediately implement a new, more expensive software solution that promises faster failover times, without a thorough evaluation of its integration with existing systems or its impact on the overall recovery strategy. Option B. Focus solely on reducing the cost of the current failover infrastructure by decommissioning redundant components, even if it means slightly extending the potential recovery time. Option C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the failover process, mapping each step, identifying bottlenecks, and evaluating the effectiveness of current recovery procedures against business requirements and regulatory mandates. Option D. Implement a series of ad hoc manual workarounds during the next simulated disaster recovery test to try and speed up the process, without formalizing or documenting these changes. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the failover process, mapping each step, identifying bottlenecks, and evaluating the effectiveness of current recovery procedures against business requirements and regulatory mandates. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust recovery capabilities with the practical constraints of budget and resource allocation. The professional is tasked with optimizing a recovery process that has been identified as inefficient. This requires not just technical understanding, but also strategic thinking to align recovery objectives with business priorities and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in identifying the root cause of inefficiency and proposing solutions that are effective, cost-efficient, and compliant with relevant regulations, without compromising the organization's resilience. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on a systematic, data-driven evaluation of the existing recovery process. This involves mapping the current state, identifying bottlenecks and redundancies, and then redesigning the process based on best practices and business requirements. This aligns with the principles of process optimization, which aim to improve efficiency, reduce costs, and enhance effectiveness. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, this approach ensures that the disaster recovery plan remains fit for purpose, capable of meeting recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, as mandated by relevant frameworks, and that resources are used responsibly. It demonstrates due diligence in maintaining an effective disaster recovery posture. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach might involve implementing a quick-fix solution without a thorough understanding of the underlying issues. This could lead to superficial improvements that do not address the root cause of inefficiency, potentially creating new vulnerabilities or failing to meet critical recovery objectives. This is professionally unacceptable, as it bypasses the due diligence required in disaster recovery planning and could lead to non-compliance with regulatory requirements for a robust and tested recovery capability. Another incorrect approach could be to focus solely on cost reduction, without considering the impact on recovery effectiveness. While cost efficiency is important, compromising the ability to recover critical business functions within acceptable timeframes is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This could result in business disruption, financial losses, and reputational damage, and would likely violate regulatory mandates that require adequate disaster recovery measures. A third incorrect approach might be to adopt a new technology or methodology without proper assessment of its suitability for the organization's specific needs and existing infrastructure. This can lead to wasted investment, increased complexity, and a recovery process that is difficult to manage and test. It fails to demonstrate professional judgment in selecting appropriate solutions, and could inadvertently weaken the overall disaster recovery posture, leading to potential regulatory scrutiny. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization by first conducting a comprehensive assessment of the current state. This involves gathering data, engaging stakeholders, and understanding business criticality. The next step is to identify specific areas for improvement, prioritizing those that have the greatest impact on resilience and compliance. Solutions should then be developed and evaluated based on their effectiveness, feasibility, cost, and alignment with regulatory requirements. Finally, any changes must be thoroughly tested and documented, with ongoing monitoring to ensure continued effectiveness. This systematic and evidence-based approach ensures that optimizations are strategic, sustainable, and meet the organization's resilience and compliance obligations. Question 10. Implementation of process optimization within the disaster recovery framework requires a structured approach to identify and address inefficiencies, considering the regulatory landscape and the need for demonstrable improvements. Which of the following methodologies best supports achieving these objectives? Option A. Implementing a series of rapid, untested changes to various recovery procedures based on industry best practices without specific organizational context. Option B. Conducting a comprehensive analysis of historical recovery performance metrics to identify specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, followed by targeted testing and validation of proposed changes before formal integration into the disaster recovery plan. Option C. Relying on the subjective feedback from key stakeholders regarding perceived inefficiencies and implementing changes based on their immediate suggestions. Option D. Prioritizing cost-cutting measures in disaster recovery processes without a thorough assessment of their impact on recovery times and overall effectiveness. The correct answer is B. Conducting a comprehensive analysis of historical recovery performance metrics to identify specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, followed by targeted testing and validation of proposed changes before formal integration into the disaster recovery plan. Explanation: the scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust recovery processes with the practical constraints of resource allocation and operational efficiency. The professional challenge lies in identifying and implementing process optimizations that demonstrably improve recovery times and reduce potential impact without compromising the integrity or compliance of the disaster recovery plan. This requires a deep understanding of the organization's critical functions, the interdependencies between systems, and the specific regulatory requirements governing its operations. Careful judgment is needed to prioritize optimizations that yield the greatest benefit for the investment and risk reduction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on a systematic, data-driven methodology for identifying and prioritizing process improvements. By analyzing recovery metrics and identifying bottlenecks, it ensures that optimizations are targeted at areas with the most significant potential for improvement. This aligns with the principles of continuous improvement and risk management, which are fundamental to effective disaster recovery. Furthermore, it ensures that any changes are validated and documented, maintaining the integrity and auditability of the disaster recovery plan, which is crucial for regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a few individuals fails to establish a clear baseline or measure the effectiveness of proposed changes. This can lead to inefficient resource allocation and potentially introduce new risks without a clear understanding of their impact. It also bypasses the necessary validation steps, which could result in a plan that is not truly optimized or compliant. Another incorrect approach that focuses on implementing changes without proper testing or documentation risks destabilizing critical recovery processes and failing to meet recovery time objectives, RTO, or recovery point objectives, RPO, during an actual event. This also creates significant audit and compliance issues. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost reduction over proven effectiveness overlooks the primary objective of disaster recovery, which is to ensure business continuity and minimize impact, potentially leading to greater financial losses in the long run. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with defining clear objectives for process optimization, such as reducing RTOs by a specific percentage or improving the success rate of critical recovery tasks. This should be followed by data collection and analysis to identify current performance metrics and potential areas for improvement. Prioritization should be based on a risk-reward assessment, considering the potential impact of a failure, the cost of implementation, and the expected benefits. Any proposed changes must undergo rigorous testing and validation before being incorporated into the formal disaster recovery plan. Finally, ongoing monitoring and periodic review are essential to ensure that optimizations remain effective and aligned with evolving business needs and regulatory requirements. Question 11. The control framework reveals that the existing disaster recovery plan requires optimization due to significant shifts in the organization's IT infrastructure and business processes. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for enhancing the plan's effectiveness and compliance? Option A. Prioritize cost reduction by scaling back recovery capabilities to meet minimum compliance requirements, even if it means extending recovery times for critical business functions. Option B. Focus on updating the disaster recovery plan documentation to reflect the new IT infrastructure, assuming the underlying recovery procedures remain valid without revalidation. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review and update of the disaster recovery plan, starting with a thorough risk assessment and business impact analysis to identify current threats, vulnerabilities, and critical business functions, and then validate recovery objectives and procedures. Option D. Implement a completely new, untested disaster recovery solution that appears more technologically advanced, bypassing a phased implementation and formal risk assessment. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review and update of the disaster recovery plan, starting with a thorough risk assessment and business impact analysis to identify current threats, vulnerabilities, and critical business functions, and then validate recovery objectives and procedures. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust, tested procedures with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the dynamic nature of business operations. The professional is tasked with optimizing a disaster recovery plan that has become outdated due to significant changes in the organization's IT infrastructure and business processes. The challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant method to update the plan without compromising its integrity or incurring excessive costs, while ensuring it aligns with current regulatory expectations for business continuity and data protection. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review and update of the disaster recovery plan, starting with a thorough risk assessment and business impact analysis. This aligns with best practices and regulatory requirements, such as those found in frameworks like NIST SB 800-34, Contingency Planning Guide for Federal Information Systems, which, while U.S.-centric, informs general professional standards for disaster recovery planning. A systematic approach ensures that the plan addresses current threats, vulnerabilities, and critical business functions. It also allows for the identification of new dependencies and the validation of recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, against current business needs. This ensures the plan is not only technically sound, but also strategically aligned with organizational goals and regulatory compliance mandates. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on updating documentation without revalidating the underlying recovery procedures is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It creates a false sense of security, as the documented plan may no longer reflect the actual capabilities or limitations of the IT environment. This can lead to non-compliance with data protection regulations, e.g., GDPR if applicable, or similar U.S. regulations like HIPAA for healthcare data, that mandate effective data recovery and business continuity. Implementing a completely new, untested disaster recovery solution without a phased approach or proper risk assessment is also professionally unacceptable. This introduces significant operational risk, potentially leading to extended downtime, data loss, and financial penalties. It bypasses critical validation steps required by many compliance frameworks to ensure the effectiveness of recovery strategies. Prioritizing cost reduction over the effectiveness of recovery capabilities is a direct contravention of the core purpose of a disaster recovery plan. While efficiency is important, compromising the ability to recover critical business functions in a timely manner can lead to severe business disruption and potential regulatory sanctions for failing to maintain adequate business continuity. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a disregard for the organization's resilience. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization in disaster recovery by adopting a structured, risk-based methodology. This involves 1. Understanding the current operational and technological landscape. 2. Conducting a comprehensive risk assessment and business impact analysis to identify critical functions and potential threats. 3. Evaluating existing recovery strategies against current business requirements and regulatory obligations. 4. Developing and documenting updated recovery procedures, ensuring they are realistic and achievable. 5. Rigorously testing the updated plan to validate its effectiveness. 6. Establishing a regular review and update cycle to maintain plan relevance. This iterative and evidence-based approach ensures that the disaster recovery plan remains a robust and compliant safeguard for the organization. Question 12. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood and high impact for the data backup and restoration process, and a moderate likelihood and moderate impact for the network infrastructure resilience. Which approach to process optimization for disaster recovery is most professionally sound? Option A. Undertake a comprehensive overhaul of the network infrastructure resilience first, assuming it is the foundational element for all other recovery processes, and then address data backup and restoration. Option B. Focus exclusively on optimizing the data backup and restoration process, as it is the highest rated risk, and defer any network infrastructure resilience improvements until the backup process is fully optimized. Option C. Implement immediate, significant cost-cutting measures across all disaster recovery processes, including the data backup and network infrastructure, to free up resources for other business initiatives. Option D. Prioritize optimizing the data backup and restoration process to ensure its robustness, while also developing a phased approach to enhance network infrastructure resilience based on available resources and the potential for future upgrades. The correct answer is D. Prioritize optimizing the data backup and restoration process to ensure its robustness, while also developing a phased approach to enhance network infrastructure resilience based on available resources and the potential for future upgrades. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust process optimization with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the dynamic nature of threats. The risk matrix, while a valuable tool, is a snapshot in time, relying solely on its current output without considering future scalability or the potential for unforeseen dependencies, can lead to inefficient or ineffective recovery processes. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the matrix not just as a static assessment, but as a driver for continuous improvement and adaptive planning, ensuring that optimization efforts are sustainable and aligned with evolving business needs and regulatory expectations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a proactive and iterative refinement of recovery processes based on the risk matrix's insights, coupled with an understanding of interdependencies and future scalability. This aligns with best professional practices by ensuring that disaster recovery plans are not only designed to address current identified risks, but are also adaptable to future changes. Regulatory frameworks, such as those implicitly guiding a disaster recovery professional, often mandate a risk-based approach that requires regular review and updating of plans. This method demonstrates due diligence by moving beyond a simple identification of risks to actively optimizing the mechanisms for recovery, thereby enhancing resilience and minimizing potential impact. It reflects a commitment to continuous improvement, a core tenet of professional disaster recovery management. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on the highest-rated risks without considering the potential for cascading failures or the impact of lower-rated risks on critical functions. This can lead to a fragmented recovery strategy that overlooks systemic vulnerabilities. Ethically, this fails to provide comprehensive protection for all business operations. Another incorrect approach prioritizes immediate cost reduction over long-term process efficiency. While cost is a factor, cutting corners on optimization can lead to significantly higher recovery costs and longer downtimes in the event of a disaster, violating the professional duty to ensure effective recovery. A third incorrect approach involves implementing changes based on the risk matrix without validating their effectiveness or considering their impact on other processes. This can introduce new risks or inefficiencies, demonstrating a lack of thoroughness and potentially violating professional standards of care. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization by first thoroughly understanding the implications of the risk matrix within the broader business context. This involves identifying critical interdependencies between processes and assessing the potential impact of optimizing one process on others. A robust decision-making framework would involve 1. Validating the risk matrix data and its assumptions. 2. Prioritizing optimization efforts based on a holistic assessment of risk reduction, operational efficiency, and business continuity. 3. Developing and testing optimized processes. And 4. Establishing a feedback loop for continuous monitoring and refinement. This systematic approach ensures that optimization efforts are strategic, effective, and aligned with the organization's overall resilience objectives. Question 13. Operational review demonstrates that while the IT department has a comprehensive list of systems to recover, the sales department is advocating for immediate restoration of their customer relationship management (CRM) system, citing its critical role in client retention, while the finance department insists their accounting software must be prioritized due to regulatory reporting deadlines. Given limited resources for immediate recovery efforts, which approach best aligns with professional disaster recovery, best practices, and regulatory expectations for a financial services organization. Option A. Allocate resources to recover the systems that are perceived as most critical by the loudest departmental voices, ensuring that key stakeholders feel their concerns are being addressed. Option B. Initiate recovery based on a documented business impact analysis, BIA, and risk assessment, RA, that objectively quantifies the impact of disruption to each department's critical functions and aligns recovery priorities with regulatory mandates for financial services. Option C. Expedite the recovery of the finance department's accounting software to meet immediate regulatory reporting deadlines, as noncompliance carries significant penalties. Option D. Prioritize the recovery of the sales department's CRM system, because client retention is directly linked to revenue generation, which is a primary business objective. The correct answer is B. Initiate recovery based on a documented business impact analysis, BIA, and risk assessment, RA, that objectively quantifies the impact of disruption to each department's critical functions and aligns recovery priorities with regulatory mandates for financial services. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the immediate needs of critical business functions with the long-term strategic goals of the organization, particularly when resources are constrained. The challenge lies in prioritizing recovery efforts without a clear, universally agreed-upon framework, potentially leading to disputes between departments and a suboptimal overall recovery posture. The professional challenge is to navigate these competing interests by applying a structured, evidence-based approach that aligns with regulatory expectations for business continuity and resilience. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a data-driven, risk-based methodology aligned with regulatory expectations for business continuity and disaster recovery. By focusing on the business impact analysis, BIA, and risk assessment, RA, the organization can objectively identify critical functions, their dependencies, and the potential impact of disruptions. This allows for the allocation of resources to address the most significant threats to the most vital operations, ensuring that recovery efforts are proportionate to the risk and aligned with regulatory requirements for maintaining essential services and protecting customer data. This approach fosters transparency and provides a defensible rationale for prioritization decisions, which is crucial for demonstrating due diligence to regulators. Incorrect approach is analysis. Prioritizing based solely on the loudest departmental voice or the perceived importance of a department without objective data is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach is subjective, prone to bias, and fails to demonstrate a systematic assessment of business impact or risk, which is a core expectation of regulatory frameworks governing disaster recovery and business continuity. It can lead to critical functions being underserved, while less essential ones receive disproportionate attention, increasing the overall risk to the organization and its stakeholders. Focusing exclusively on the cost of recovery without considering the potential business impact or regulatory penalties is also a failure. Cost effectiveness is important. It cannot be the sole determinant of recovery priorities. Regulatory requirements often mandate specific recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, for critical functions, regardless of their perceived cost to restore. Ignoring these requirements can lead to non-compliance and significant financial and reputational damage. Adopting a wait-and-see approach to recovery planning, assuming that the business can adapt to disruptions as they occur, is a direct contravention of disaster recovery principles and regulatory mandates. This reactive stance demonstrates a lack of preparedness and a failure to proactively manage risks, leaving the organization vulnerable to prolonged outages and severe consequences. It fails to meet the fundamental expectation of having a robust and tested disaster recovery plan in place. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach disaster recovery prioritization by first establishing a clear understanding of the organization's critical business functions and their dependencies through a comprehensive business impact analysis, BIA. This should be followed by a thorough risk assessment, RA, to identify potential threats and their likelihood. The results of the BIA and RA should then be used to develop recovery strategies that align with regulatory requirements, such as defined recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO. Decisions on resource allocation and recovery sequencing must be transparent, documented, and justifiable based on this objective analysis. Regular testing and review of the disaster recovery plan are essential to ensure its effectiveness and compliance. Question 14. Implementation of a disaster recovery strategy for a critical financial reporting system requires careful consideration of regulatory mandates. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of effective disaster recovery planning and regulatory compliance within the context of the 312-76 Disaster Recovery Professional Practice Test Framework? Option A. Developing recovery objectives based on a comprehensive business impact analysis that identifies critical business functions, their interdependencies, and defines specific recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, for each. Option B. Implementing a recovery solution that prioritizes the lowest initial cost, even if it means compromising on the speed or completeness of recovery for certain critical functions. Option C. Replicating the entire production environment, including non-essential components, to ensure a complete system restoration regardless of immediate business criticality. Option D. Relying on informal discussions with key stakeholders and past experiences to estimate recovery needs without formal documentation or testing. The correct answer is A. Developing recovery objectives based on a comprehensive business impact analysis that identifies critical business functions, their interdependencies, and defines specific recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, for each. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster recovery planning, balancing the need for robust recovery capabilities with the practicalities of regulatory compliance and resource allocation. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying the specific requirements of the 312-76 Disaster Recovery Professional Practice Test Framework, which emphasizes adherence to established protocols and demonstrable readiness, while also considering the organization's unique operational context and risk appetite. A key aspect is ensuring that the chosen recovery strategy not only meets the minimum regulatory thresholds, but also provides a realistic and effective solution in the event of a disruption. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a comprehensive assessment of critical business functions and their interdependencies. This aligns with the core principles of disaster recovery planning, which mandate a business-driven approach. By identifying recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, based on business impact analysis, the organization ensures that recovery efforts are focused on the most critical operations first, thereby maximizing the chances of business continuity. This systematic, risk-based methodology is implicitly supported by the professional standards expected in disaster recovery, which value preparedness and the ability to restore essential services within defined parameters. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on replicating the production environment without a thorough business impact analysis fails to address the fundamental question of what is truly essential for business survival. This can lead to inefficient resource allocation and a recovery plan that is overly complex and costly, without necessarily improving the recovery of critical functions. It represents a technical-centric rather than a business-centric approach, potentially violating the spirit of regulatory frameworks that aim for effective business continuity. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without formal validation overlooks the dynamic nature of business operations and the potential for unforeseen dependencies or changes in criticality. This can result in a recovery plan that is not aligned with current business needs or regulatory expectations, leading to potential compliance gaps and an inadequate response during a disaster. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to structured planning methodologies. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost savings above all else, potentially by deferring essential recovery capabilities or neglecting regular testing, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Disaster recovery is fundamentally about risk mitigation and ensuring the organization's resilience. Undermining this for short-term financial gain exposes the organization to unacceptable levels of risk and can lead to severe business disruption, financial losses, and reputational damage, all of which are contrary to the objectives of professional disaster recovery practice and regulatory oversight. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, iterative approach. This begins with understanding the specific regulatory landscape, in this case, the 312-76 framework. It then proceeds to a thorough business impact analysis to identify critical functions and their recovery requirements. This is followed by a risk assessment to understand potential threats and vulnerabilities. Based on these inputs, recovery strategies are developed, documented, and regularly tested. Continuous review and updates are essential to ensure the plan remains relevant and effective. Question 15. When evaluating the effectiveness of a disaster recovery plan from a stakeholder perspective, which approach best ensures alignment with regulatory expectations for operational resilience and business continuity? Option A. Relying on anecdotal evidence and past experiences of IT staff to determine the scope and priorities of the disaster recovery plan, without formal documentation or validation. Option B. Conducting a comprehensive business impact analysis involving all critical business units to identify dependencies, recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, and then developing recovery strategies that address these requirements within regulatory frameworks. Option C. Focusing on minimizing the cost of disaster recovery solutions by selecting the most basic and least expensive options available, without a thorough assessment of their ability to meet recovery objectives. Option D. Prioritizing the recovery of IT infrastructure based on technical specifications and vendor recommendations, with minimal input from business unit leaders. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing the recovery of IT infrastructure based on technical specifications and vendor recommendations, with minimal input from business unit leaders. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate needs of business continuity with the long-term strategic implications of disaster recovery planning, all while adhering to specific regulatory requirements. The stakeholder perspective is crucial, as different groups will have varying priorities and risk tolerances. A professional disaster recovery plan must integrate these perspectives to ensure comprehensive coverage and stakeholder buy-in. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, risk-based methodology that aligns with regulatory expectations for due diligence and preparedness. By involving key stakeholders from the outset, it ensures that the plan addresses critical business functions, complies with relevant regulations, such as those governing data protection and operational resilience, and is supported by those who will be responsible for its execution and oversight. This proactive engagement fosters a shared understanding of risks and mitigation strategies, leading to a more robust and effective disaster recovery capability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical recovery without considering business impact analysis fails to meet regulatory requirements for understanding critical business processes and their dependencies. This oversight can lead to a plan that prioritizes the wrong systems or functions, leaving the organization vulnerable to significant operational and financial losses during a disaster. Furthermore, it neglects the ethical obligation to protect customer data and maintain service levels, which are often mandated by regulations. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction above all else, potentially by neglecting essential testing or redundant infrastructure, demonstrates a failure to adequately assess and manage risk. This can lead to a plan that is insufficient to restore operations within acceptable timeframes, violating regulatory mandates for operational resilience and potentially exposing the organization to severe penalties and reputational damage. It also overlooks the ethical responsibility to ensure the organization can continue to operate and serve its customers. Professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify all relevant stakeholders and their interests. Second, conduct a thorough business impact analysis to understand the criticality of different functions and the potential consequences of their disruption. Third, perform a risk assessment to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities. Fourth, develop recovery strategies that are aligned with business needs, regulatory requirements, and risk tolerance. Fifth, document the plan clearly and comprehensively. And finally, establish a regular testing and review process to ensure its continued effectiveness. This structured decision-making process ensures that all critical aspects are considered, leading to a well-rounded and compliant disaster recovery plan. Question 16. Strategic planning requires a clear understanding of how critical business functions will be restored in the event of a disaster. Following a significant system outage impacting a core financial processing application, the IT recovery team is eager to restore services as quickly as possible. However, the established disaster recovery (DR) plan outlines a specific sequence of recovery steps for this application, including dependencies on other systems that are also affected. What is the most professionally responsible approach for the IT recovery team to take in this situation? Option A. Activate the incident response team as outlined in the DR plan, assess the full impact of the disaster, and initiate recovery procedures strictly according to the documented plan and its defined dependencies. Option B. Immediately begin restoring the financial processing application using the quickest technical methods available, even if it means deviating from the documented DR plan sequence and dependencies. Option C. Focus solely on restoring the most user-facing components of the financial processing application to provide immediate, albeit partial, service to customers. Option D. Implement a novel recovery solution that was not part of the original DR plan, but appears to be a faster technical workaround. Correct answer is B. Immediately begin restoring the financial processing application using the quickest technical methods available, even if it means deviating from the documented DR plan sequence and dependencies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate operational needs of a critical business function with the long-term strategic imperative of robust disaster recovery. The pressure to restore services quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise the integrity and effectiveness of the DR plan, potentially violating regulatory requirements for business continuity and data protection. Careful judgment is needed to ensure that immediate recovery actions align with, rather than undermine, the established DR strategy. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes adherence to the predefined DR plan and its established procedures. This represents best professional practice because it ensures that recovery efforts are systematic, tested, and aligned with the organization's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Following the plan minimizes the risk of introducing new vulnerabilities during a crisis and provides a documented, auditable process. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate documented and tested business continuity and disaster recovery plans, ensuring operational resilience and data integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. Prioritizing immediate, ad hoc restoration without consulting the DR plan is professionally unacceptable. This approach bypasses established protocols, increasing the risk of incomplete recovery, data corruption, or security breaches. It fails to meet regulatory requirements for a structured and tested recovery process, potentially leading to significant business disruption and reputational damage. Focusing solely on restoring the most visible or frequently used systems without a comprehensive assessment of interdependencies, as outlined in the DR plan, is also professionally unsound. This can lead to a cascade of failures in dependent systems, rendering the partial recovery ineffective. It neglects the holistic approach mandated by DR best practices and regulatory oversight, which requires consideration of all critical business functions and their supporting infrastructure. Implementing recovery steps that were not part of the documented and tested DR plan, even if they appear technically feasible, introduces significant risk. This deviates from the established framework, potentially introducing unknown vulnerabilities or compliance gaps. Regulatory bodies expect organizations to operate within their approved and tested DR frameworks, and deviations without proper validation and documentation can lead to non-compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first activating the incident response team as per the DR plan. This team is responsible for assessing the situation, determining the scope of the disaster, and initiating the recovery process according to the documented and tested procedures. The decision-making process should be guided by the DR plan's recovery objectives, priorities, and rollback procedures. If the plan needs to be adapted due to unforeseen circumstances, any changes must be documented, approved, and ideally tested in a controlled environment before full implementation, ensuring continued compliance and effectiveness. Question 17. The monitoring system demonstrates a critical failure in the primary customer data processing application, leading to a complete halt in transaction processing for the last hour. Based on the 312-76 Disaster Recovery Professional Practice Test Framework, which of the following actions best represents the immediate professional response? Option A. Focus solely on identifying the root cause of the failure through extensive system diagnostics before initiating any recovery steps to prevent recurrence. Option B. Initiate the documented disaster recovery procedure for the customer data processing application, prioritizing restoration of core transaction capabilities and ensuring all recovery steps are logged. Option C. Inform the IT department of the failure and await their instructions on how to proceed with the recovery. Option D. Immediately attempt a manual workaround by rerouting transactions to a secondary, less robust system to resume processing as quickly as possible, deferring formal recovery procedures until after business hours. Correct answer is B. Initiate the documented disaster recovery procedure for the customer data processing application, prioritizing restoration of core transaction capabilities and ensuring all recovery steps are logged. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a critical failure in a key business process, directly impacting the organization's ability to meet its contractual obligations and regulatory reporting requirements. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate action to mitigate further damage, a thorough understanding of the underlying cause, and clear communication with stakeholders, all while adhering to the strict regulatory framework of the 312-76 Disaster Recovery Professional Practice Test. The pressure to restore service quickly can lead to rushed decisions that overlook critical recovery steps or compliance mandates. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented recovery process that prioritizes the restoration of essential functions according to the established disaster recovery plan. This aligns with regulatory expectations for business continuity and disaster recovery, which mandate that organizations have robust plans in place and can execute them effectively. It ensures that recovery efforts are not only swift but also compliant, minimizing legal and financial exposure. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to operational resilience, as expected by regulatory bodies overseeing such critical infrastructure. An incorrect approach that bypasses established recovery protocols to achieve a faster, albeit potentially unstable, restoration would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to data corruption, security vulnerabilities, or a failure to meet compliance standards, all of which carry significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as failing to adequately document the recovery process or the root cause of the failure, would violate audit requirements and hinder future improvements, demonstrating a lack of professional rigor and potentially leading to noncompliance with record-keeping mandates. Furthermore, withholding critical information from relevant stakeholders, such as senior management or regulatory bodies, would be an ethical and regulatory failure, undermining transparency and trust. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with assessing the immediate impact and severity of the failure. This should be followed by a review of the disaster recovery plan to identify the appropriate response procedures. Communication with key stakeholders should be initiated early and maintained throughout the recovery process. Documentation of all actions taken, decisions made, and lessons learned is paramount for compliance and continuous improvement. This structured approach ensures that recovery efforts are effective, efficient, and compliant with all applicable regulations. Question 18. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of a critical system failure impacting customer data integrity, with a moderate potential impact on regulatory compliance. Which of the following disaster recovery strategies best addresses this specific risk profile from a stakeholder perspective? Option A. Delay notifying regulatory bodies about the potential for data integrity issues until a definitive breach has been confirmed, to avoid unnecessary alarm and administrative burden. Option B. Focus on minimizing the cost of disaster recovery by selecting the most basic backup solution and conducting recovery tests only annually, assuming that the moderate regulatory impact is manageable. Option C. Implement a multi-layered data backup solution with frequent automated backups and a robust, regularly tested recovery process, coupled with clear communication channels to inform affected stakeholders and regulatory bodies of the recovery status. Option D. Prioritize the immediate restoration of core system functionality, deferring detailed data integrity checks and recovery validation until after the primary operational disruption has been resolved. The correct answer is C. Implement a multi-layered data backup solution with frequent, automated backups and a robust, regularly tested recovery process, coupled with clear communication channels to inform affected stakeholders and regulatory bodies of the recovery status. Explanation: the risk matrix shows a high likelihood of a critical system failure impacting customer data integrity, with a moderate potential impact on regulatory compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate operational concerns with long-term compliance obligations, all while managing stakeholder expectations. The challenge lies in prioritizing mitigation efforts when resources are finite and different stakeholder groups may have competing priorities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified high-risk scenario by proposing a comprehensive disaster recovery plan that includes robust data backup and recovery procedures, regular testing, and clear communication protocols. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and prudent risk management expected under general professional conduct guidelines, ensuring business continuity and minimizing potential regulatory breaches. It demonstrates a proactive stance in safeguarding sensitive information and maintaining operational resilience. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate system restoration without addressing data integrity issues fails to meet the professional standard. This would be a regulatory failure, as it neglects the obligation to protect customer data, potentially violating data protection laws and leading to significant fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction over comprehensive testing of recovery procedures is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to ensuring the effectiveness of the disaster recovery plan, which could result in a failure to recover critical systems and data when needed, thereby failing to meet the duty of care to stakeholders and potentially contravening regulatory requirements for business continuity. A third incorrect approach that delays communication with regulatory bodies until after an incident occurs is a clear ethical and regulatory failure. Transparency and timely reporting are often mandated and are crucial for maintaining trust and demonstrating accountability. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the risk assessment and its implications. This involves identifying all relevant stakeholders and their concerns, evaluating potential mitigation strategies against their effectiveness, cost, and feasibility, and then selecting the option that best balances operational needs, regulatory compliance, and stakeholder interests. Continuous monitoring and adaptation of the disaster recovery plan based on evolving risks and regulatory landscapes are also critical components of professional decision-making. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows a business unit has identified the failure of a specific critical application as the sole trigger for invoking their disaster recovery plan. Which of the following decision-making frameworks best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for comprehensive disaster recovery? Option A. Prioritizing recovery efforts based on a comprehensive business impact analysis, BIA, that identifies critical business functions, their dependencies, and associated RTOS/RPOs, then aligning IT recovery strategies accordingly. Option B. Deferring the disaster recovery plan activation until the application failure has demonstrably impacted multiple downstream business processes. Option C. Focusing recovery efforts on the application that is technically the most complex to restore, ensuring its availability as a priority. Option D. Initiating the disaster recovery plan immediately upon the identification of the critical application failure, regardless of its immediate impact on other business functions. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing recovery efforts based on a comprehensive business impact analysis, BIA, that identifies critical business functions, their dependencies, and associated RTOS/RPOs, then aligning IT recovery strategies accordingly. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture in disaster recovery planning where a business unit has identified a critical application failure as the primary driver for a recovery strategy. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the disaster recovery professional to move beyond a single point of failure and consider the broader organizational impact and interdependencies. A purely application-centric view can lead to an incomplete or inefficient recovery plan that doesn't account for upstream data dependencies, downstream user access, or the overall business process continuity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it mandates a holistic, business impact-driven decision-making framework. This aligns with regulatory expectations that disaster recovery plans should support the continuity of critical business functions, not just individual IT components. By prioritizing based on business impact and recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO, derived from business needs, the plan ensures that the most vital operations are restored first, minimizing financial and reputational damage. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes the organization's overall resilience and stakeholder interests. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the application's technical criticality without considering its business context fails to meet regulatory requirements for comprehensive business continuity. It risks overinvesting in the recovery of less critical functions while neglecting those that are truly essential for the organization's survival. This can lead to regulatory noncompliance if the plan doesn't adequately address the continuity of regulated business processes. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes recovery based on the ease of technical implementation rather than business impact is also professionally unacceptable. This can result in a plan that is technically feasible but strategically flawed, potentially leaving critical business operations vulnerable for extended periods. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to best practices in risk management. The professional reasoning process should involve engaging with business stakeholders to understand their critical processes and the impact of disruptions. This collaborative approach ensures that RTOs and RPOs are realistic and aligned with business needs. The disaster recovery professional then translates these business requirements into technical recovery strategies, ensuring that the plan is both effective and efficient. This iterative process of business assessment, risk analysis, and technical solutioning forms the bedrock of sound disaster recovery decision-making.